a single revolver blast splits the dawn over the high desert. Clara Whitford's breath snags in her throat as she hurls herself behind a barrel outside the Half Moon Saloon. Wood splinters above her head, the echo ricochets down Dry Creek's one dusty street. She tastes iron in the air and realizes it is her own blood, just a graze along the ear, nothing fatal, but the sound, the smell, the suddenness drag her straight back to the canyon road where her family died. She fights the urge to collapse. Panic can wait, survival cannot. Across the street, Buck Red Tully lowers his smoking Colt .45, eyes narrowing when he fails to see her fall. His gang laughs, spurs clinking as they shove through swinging doors to collect the week's protection from the terrified barkeep. Clara presses a trembling hand to her ear, feeling the warm trickle, then forces her legs to move. She darts into the alley, boots sliding in red dust, heart hammering. 6 months she has kept her head down, pouring whiskey for miners and cardsharps, and still the past sniffs her out. She reaches the stable and almost collides with a tall man tightening the cinch on a bay gelding. Weather-creased face, gray at the temples, eyes the color of winter sage, Elias McCade. The reclusive rancher rarely ventures into town, yet here he is. He takes in her blood-streaked cheek, the terror flickering behind her composure. "You ride?" he asks quietly. She nods, breathless. He swings her into the saddle, mounts behind without another word, and heels the horse into a dead run just as Tully steps back onto the boardwalk. Hooves drum like thunder. Dust cloaks their flight. A bullet whistles past, but the desert yawns open to swallow them whole, leaving Tully cursing at empty horizon. Hours later the bay lathers to a halt atop a ridge overlooking McCade Ranch, miles of sun-bleached grass, a clapboard house, a barn leaning into the wind. Elias dismounts first, offers a calloused hand. Clara hesitates, unsure if she has escaped or traded one danger for another, yet something in his stillness, neither pity nor demand, nudges her forward. Inside the house the silence feels almost sacred. No clock ticks, no voices linger. Only the faint creak of floorboards and, far off, cattle lowing. He cleans the cut at her ear, his fingers efficient, gentle. She expects questions, he asks none. Instead he sets a chipped mug of coffee before her, black as night and just as unforgiving. "You can stay till it's safe," he says. Safe is a word she no longer trusts, but exhaustion roots her to the chair. Outside, afternoon wanes into a fiery sunset that paints the plains copper and blood. She remembers her father's laugh echoing off canyon walls, her mother's hymn carried on stagecoach wheels, and the shots that silenced both. She clamps the memories behind clenched teeth, yet Elias seems to read the storm in her eyes. He stirs another log into the stove and leaves her to the glow. At dawn she wakes to the smell of dust and strong coffee. Elias is already outside, driving cattle toward fresh pasture. Instinct, or maybe gratitude, pulls her into borrowed boots and out to the corral, where she finds an unsaddled Mustang testing the rails. She speaks low, palm forward, inching closer until the horse's breath warms her knuckles. Elias watches from the gate, surprise flickering beneath his brim when the Mustang yields its head. The smallest of trusts, born of shared skittishness. Days stretch into a rhythm, sunrise tasks, blistered palms, quiet meals punctured by sudden, startling fragments of conversation. He lost his wife, she learns, during childbirth. He buried both bodies under a lone juniper up on Hawk's Bluff and hasn't spoken of them since. She tells him nothing of her own ghosts, yet he senses them in the way she flinches at distant gunfire or wakes gasping from dreams. One evening high clouds bruise purple over the range. A heat-charged wind rattles the porch lantern as they sit side by side, neither willing to retreat indoors. At last she asks why he helped her. Elias studies the darkening horizon before answering. Storm was coming. Figured 2 riders stand a better chance than 1. She almost laughs at the understatement, bandits equal to weather, violence as natural as rain. But in his voice she hears a man who has already survived the worst and no longer bargains with fate, only with practicality and, perhaps, a sliver of compassion he keeps hidden like a broken spur. Thunder rolls. Lightning ghosts across the valley, illuminating the barn roof, the fences, the lines of his face. She finds herself speaking of the canyon road, the gunfire, her parents' bodies jolted from the coach, her brother's last breath rattling against her shoulder. Words spill like floodwater until the storm breaks overhead and rain hammers the tin roof. Elias listens without interruption, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. When she finishes, the only sound is rain and her own ragged breathing. "You stayed alive," he says at last. "Sometimes that's the hardest part." The storm slacks. In its wake the air smells of sage and turned earth. For the first time since the Canyon massacre, Clara feels something uncoil inside her, a tight knot loosening, not gone but less deadly. Morning brings a telegram rider galloping up the lane. He dismounts, eyes flicking to Clara before handing Elias the message. Tully's gang burned the sheriff's office, killed 2 deputies, and took control of Dry Creek. They are demanding tribute from every rancher within 2 days, or retribution. Elias folds the paper, gaze settling on the horizon where thunderheads still linger. He tells Clara she can ride south to Bisbee, catch the rail east, vanish. She shakes her head before he finishes. Running has won her nothing but nightmares. The road only circles back to fear. That night they unearth Elias's locked gun cabinet. She checks the rifle's sights, loads shells with steady hands. He watches, remembering the trembling debtor he hoisted onto his horse. Now her eyes carry flint and purpose. They ride at first light, 2 silhouettes against a sky the color of tarnished silver, bound for a reckoning neither sought yet both accept. Clara's pulse surges, but beneath it lies a fierce, unfamiliar clarity. She is no longer too broken to heal, nor too lost to be found. Somewhere between the first gunshot in Dry Creek and the quiet mercy of this rancher's porch, she has begun to remember how to fight for the living instead of merely fleeing the dead. And Buck Tully, with his smoke-scarred laugh and blood debt unpaid, is about to learn the difference. Dust cloaked the sunrise as Clara and Elias cut south along the dry wash, keeping the sun on their left shoulders and the San Pedro River's distant shimmer at their right. The land unrolled in muted golds and bruised greens, nothing but mesquite, ocotillo, and the occasional jackrabbit streaking for cover. Somewhere ahead, beyond the low rise of Chaparral Ridge, Dry Creek lay in the grip of Buck Tully's gang. Every hoofbeat hammered that fact through Clara's ribs. Yet for all the tension coiling inside her, the ride felt strangely steady, almost deliberate, as though each mile stitched new resolve where old wounds had been. They halted at a stand of cottonwoods not far from the main trail. Elias dismounted to water the horses while Clara crouched over the narrow stream, letting the cold trickle numb her fingers. Wind hissed through cottonwood leaves, a sound she remembered from childhood picnics before everything burned away. Now it felt like an omen, fragile, restless, impossible to silence. She splashed her face, tasting iron left from the healing cut, and wondered whether courage was simply terror that had run out of exits. Elias returned with a battered canteen and a calm she could almost lean against. He unrolled a penciled map on the dirt between them, Dry Creek sketched like a spider in the center, roads branching to mines, ranches, and the telegraph line. He described Tully's pattern: liquor, threats, a show of force, then withdrawal to the hills above town. His gang favored the abandoned copper tunnels there, dry and cool enough to hide men and ammunition. The sheriff's office, now torched, had stood across from the freight depot. Its charred beams likely formed the gang's bonfire of triumph the previous night. Clara studied the map, tracing routes with a fingertip grimy from trail dust. Approaching through town meant a crossfire. Sliding around back of the hills risked mineshaft collapses. She pointed to a faint arroyo feeding the river bend. If they reached the arroyo by dusk, they could scale the ridge under moonlight, use the mine catwalks to drop behind the sentries. Elias watched her think, the ghost of admiration in his eyes, but said nothing until she finished outlining the plan. A man could follow that, he murmured. Question is, should he? Clara met his gaze. The question answering itself inside her felt heavier than the rifle slung across her back. She was not here to play outlaw or martyr. She wanted the road clear, the fear buried, the dead named and finally at rest. Tully's shadow blocked every one of those desires. She did not know what justice cost, only that the price of silence had long ago bankrupted her. They traveled through the heat of day, stopping once to let a freight caravan rattle past, a dozen wagons guarded by Pinkerton men too intent on their payroll strongboxes to notice two riders skulking in the brush. As the sun dipped, they angled into the arroyo. Evening light slanted over sandstone walls, painting them a deep, sullen red. A coyote yipped somewhere high above, then another answered farther off, the calls braiding like frayed rope across the sky. Clara's mind wandered to her parents' voices, to her brother's teasing whistle whenever he spotted a hawk riding thermals. She tried to hold the memory steady, neither flinching nor clutching them too hard, the way Elias held the reins, firm but forgiving. When darkness pooled thick enough to hide movement, he signaled a halt. They tied the horses beneath an overhang, muffled the bits with strips of cloth, and began the climb. Loose shale slid beneath their boots. The ridge smelled of copper and dry rot, the lingering breath of tunnels driven into the mountain decades earlier. At a ledge overlooking Dry Creek, they crouched. Lantern light flickered in the ruins of the sheriff's office, laughter drifted up, coarse and guileless, from men who believed they owned the night. Clara felt anger fold into focus. She chambered around, steadied her breathing, and waited while Elias scanned the slopes. He counted 6 visible men, maybe 3 more inside the depot office they'd commandeered. The rest, perhaps a dozen, would be bedding down in the copper tunnels. Their advantage lay in surprise, but surprise could sour in an instant. Elias suggested splitting. He would circle to the tunnel entrance, set a fuse to a cache of dynamite rumored to be stored there. The blast would flush the men out or seal them inside. Clara would cover the depot, cutting off retreat toward town. They would meet near the well behind the livery stable. No good luck words, no promises. Only a curt nod, then the two shapes parted into different slices of darkness. Clara descended a goat trail, every sense pricked, the rasp of her own breath, the muted clank of the rifle sling, the sweet bitter tang of creosote wafting on cooling air. From this angle she saw the depot windows glowing orange. Tully himself lounged on the platform, boots propped, hat tipped back. A bottle gleamed in his fist. The sight froze her marrow, so casual, so intact, as though murder never left a stain. She steadied the rifle, but shooting from here risked alerting the others before Elias set the charge. She eased lower, slipping between barrel stacks and crates until the platform loomed 10 paces away. Voices floated from inside, talk of heading north after sunrise, emptying McCade Ranch on the way. Clara's pulse hammered so loudly she feared it might give her away. She tightened her grip, picturing Elias's slanted handwriting on the map, the careful way he had cleaned her wound, the quiet grief he disguised as stoicism. If these men reached his land, his cattle, the juniper graves, they would poison even the small sanctuary he had clawed out of loss. A distant thud rolled through the ground, barely audible, yet enough to rattle lantern glass. Then another, sharper, echoing from the hill. Clara's lips parted in a breath that tasted of gun oil and anticipation. A guard on the depot porch straightened, squinting at the ridge. Tully waved him off, but the man hesitated, unease creeping across his face like dawn across desert. The next sound cracked the night wide open, a concussive roar that flung red light skyward from the hilltop. The mountain seemed to exhale fire. Debris rained down the slope. Shouts rose from the depot as outlaws spilled onto the platform, rifles swinging. Clara stepped from shadow and fired. The nearest man jerked back, lamp shattering at his feet. Darkness swallowed the platform. She fired again, cutting a second silhouette mid-stride. Panic tumbled the rest down the stairs. Tully roared orders drowned by the rifle's retort. Bullets snapped past Clara's ear, punched splinters from crate wood. She rolled behind a wagon tongue, reloading with fingers she forced to remain sure. Another flash lit the ridge, Elias signaling, perhaps, or a second charge catching a mine pocket. The hillside thundered like a giant's heartbeat. Clara rose long enough to send 2 shots toward the platform, heard a cry, ducked. Feet pounded gravel behind the depot, men fleeing for horses. She pivoted, sprinted to intercept, dropping to one knee near the water trough. Muzzle flare burst along the hitch rail, one rider slumped forward, reins tangling. Another leaped clear of a gelding and vanished between buildings. Smoke stung Clara's eyes. The yard swam with shadows and streaks of red fire. She searched for Tully, but the platform lay empty, lanterns rolling, glass crunching under fleeing boots. Boot heels scraped wood behind her. She spun. Tully's figure loomed, Colt leveled. His first shot blasted the trough's rim, dousing her in cold water. She threw herself sideways, rifle skidding from damp hands. The second shot ricocheted off the wagon iron. Tully advanced, mouth twisted in a grin carved by whiskey and arrogance. "Didn't stay dead, girl?" he taunted. "Let's finish your folks' work." Clara scrabbled for the rifle, found only mud. Tully cocked the hammer. A third gunshot cut across his words, and Buck Tully staggered, eyes wide, clutching his side. Elias emerged from smoke at the yard's edge, revolver steady. Tully whipped around, firing wildly. A bullet grazed Elias's sleeve, another spun into darkness. Clara lunged for her rifle, rolled onto her back, sighted. Memory flooded, her father teaching her to shoot tin cans off fence posts, telling her to breathe, squeeze. She breathed. She squeezed. Tully's hat flew, he stumbled once, twice, then collapsed beside the trough, water lapping his boots. The yard fell abruptly silent but for distant crackle of burning timbers and Elias's boots crunching gravel as he crossed to her. She propped on an elbow, suddenly aware of the trembling that seized her limbs now that danger had ebbed. Elias knelt, eyes sweeping her for wounds. She shook her head, only bruises, nothing mortal. His own sleeve darkened where the graze bled, yet he dismissed it with a shrug. Around them, outlaws lay scattered, moaning or mute. Those left breathing tossed weapons aside at Elias's command. The ridge fire still glowed, sealing tunnels and, with them, whatever fight remained. When dawn broke, Dry Creek's few townsfolk crept from hiding to find Clara and Elias standing beside the ruined depot. Smoke drifted upward like prayers gone threadbare. The blacksmith, hat in trembling hands, asked what came next. Elias nodded toward Clara, as though the answer belonged to her. She looked at the faces ringed with ash and fear, at the street where her nightmare had renewed itself only days before. Words felt heavy, but she found them. Bury the dead, mend the town, guard each other. No tribute. No more running. In the following hours, they helped drag timbers off the collapsed jail, doused embers, bandaged the wounded. A makeshift gallows rose for the surviving bandits, the townsfolk voted swift judgment. Clara watched without triumph. Justice, she realized, tasted less like victory than like stillness, an absence of dread where something calmer might someday grow. By afternoon, they stood beside fresh graves on the hill above town. Wind shivered the sparse grass. Elias spoke a short prayer for souls better left between each man and whatever god he carried. Clara whispered her family's names into the wind, feeling them settle instead of haunt. They rode back to the ranch beneath a sky scrubbed clean by desert blue. Neither spoke until the clapboard house came into view, edges glowing in late light. Clara drew rein, staring at the porch where she had once arrived half dead. In the hush she felt the strangeness of surviving, the awkward question of where a life resumes after the gunfire stops. Elias dismounted, tied his horse, then offered a hand as though inviting her to step into a dance neither knew. She took it and felt the steadiness that had carried her from barrel-edge terror to this quiet dusk. Together they walked toward the house. The desert, vast and indifferent, spread around them, yet the small rectangle of lamplight spilling from the open door seemed to stake a claim against all that emptiness. Inside, he ground coffee while she washed soot from her arms. Later they sat at the table till stars wheeled past the windows. She spoke of planting a kitchen garden come spring, of repairing the north fence before calving season. He answered with plans for a windmill to draw deeper water. Simple words, future-shaped, that startled them both with their ordinariness. When fatigue finally pulled her toward sleep, she paused at the doorway, looking back at him. "Too lost for finding," she said softly, almost to herself. Elias met her gaze, lantern light reflecting in eyes the color of winter sage. Found anyway, he replied. She carried the words upstairs, tucking them beside the ache and the relief, uncertain which would rise stronger in the morning. Outside, coyotes lifted their chorus to the night, wild and mournful and utterly alive. Clara listened, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, she did not flinch. Spring crept across the high desert in muted greens, the kind that appear overnight and vanish the moment sun turns cruel again. Clara rose before first light and walked the fence-line with a coil of wire over one shoulder, the horizon rinsed in pale rose. Each step felt like a cautious question answered by the simple fact of soil under her boots. She still woke some nights braced for shots that never came, but dawns arrived quieter now, carrying chores instead of dread. At the barn Elias pitched hay with slow, deliberate strokes. The graze on his arm had knit to a pale seam, one more story he preferred not to tell. He watched her cross the yard, noting the easy way she shifted the coil, the faint smile she reserved for mornings when the air smelled of mesquite blossom. Without a word he handed her a pair of pliers. They worked side by side along the north pasture, stretching new wire where winter storms had torn gaps. Calves trailed after them, gawky and curious, muzzles damp with milk. Near midday a rider appeared on the far ridge, dust cloud trailing like a torn banner. Clara's pulse kicked, an old reflex, but the figure slowed, raising an unarmed hand. When he reached the gate she recognized Sheriff Albright, new badge, new resolve since Dry Creek's reckoning. He dismounted, hat in hand, offering news. The governor had issued a warrant commending Elias and Clara for dismantling Tully's gang. A reward would follow once probate cleared the seized freight money. Albright, voice lowered, also carried rumor that the railroad planned a spur through these parts, buying grazing rights at 3 times market price. Elias listened, jaw tight against cautious hope. Money meant stock improvements, maybe a schoolhouse in town. Yet railroads carried strangers, change, the thin edge of progress that cuts as often as it cures. He said he'd think on it. The sheriff nodded, remounted, and disappeared into sunlight, leaving the ranch hushed except for cicadas rasping in the cottonwoods. That evening Clara sat on the porch rail, legs swinging, while Elias lit the lamp inside. She considered the hills glowing violet beyond the paddocks, the faint scratch of an owl waking in the rafters. She thought of rail lines snaking through valleys, of telegram wires stitching the horizon, of towns rising and falling like mirages. Restlessness edged her contentment, the old wanderer in her blood tugging at possibilities. Elias stepped onto the porch, leaning against the post. He said he could run the ranch fine alone if she wanted the rail line's promise of elsewhere. She answered with a slow shake of her head, surprised at how little pull the horizon held tonight. What she wanted was harder to name, not escape, not even safety, but a place where memory and tomorrow could share the same ground without fighting. Here, the land listened, here, mornings arrived less heavy. He nodded once, relief flickering across features usually carved from reserve. Inside the house the lantern flame jittered, painting both their shadows long and uncertain against the wall. Clara tipped her hat brim toward him, half-grin breaking the solemnity. Maybe she'd sell a few acres to the railroad, she said, build that schoolhouse, teach children to read the world before it read them. Elias raised an eyebrow at the word she'd slipped in, our acres, not yours or mine. In the silence that followed, coyotes called from the draw, their chorus no longer a threat but a reminder that wildness still roamed just beyond the fence. Clara listened, heart steady. The night answered with its own vast hush, as if daring her to fill it. She stepped off the rail, boots thudding on the porch planks, and reached for the door. Behind her Elias followed, the lamp inside casting warm light across weathered floorboards and the small, unfinished shape of a life they were learning to craft. The door closed, not to shut the world out, but to gather it, dust, danger, promise and all, into something that could finally be called home.